storytelling, because storytelling is an oral art form. It's a cultural practice, and it's something quite different from writing traditions, because if you tell a story in oral speech, it's quite different than if you read it in a book, for example. So this is something I've been observing early on, and which also I was reflecting on, as you'll see, in the context of my research. I will just go back to my early experiences in the 1980s, when I started to do field work in the Sangkwa Saba district in eastern Nepal. And my aim at that time was to record stories, mythology, and so I went out and just asked people to tell me stories. But then I realized that there's some problem with the concepts, because I was talking about kata, and you know that there are different terms how you can translate narration. Sometimes in Nepali it can be varnan garnu, or it can be purapataunu, or kata sunaunu. So this is what I was asking the people to do, kata sunaunus, and the reaction was that they didn't quite understand what I wanted, and they said, well, go up there, up in the next village, somebody, some purka, some elder will be able to help me. And I had the impression in the first weeks of my research that actually these stories somehow are no longer alive. I had heard about stories from other books, but somehow they didn't seem to be alive anymore. But then I found that when I changed the question and asked people, for example, where do you come from, immediately people started telling stories. And that's especially, I think, among the Kirati, but also among other groups, a very important issue to talk about. So this is what I realized, that actually the stories which I was trying to get are all about the past somehow, about origins, about migrations, and so this is eventually how I found out that actually everybody was able to tell me the story, so you just have to ask the right question. So this was my first experience with the concept of the mundum, and this is what I will be talking about today. This is the concept of the oral tradition, which is in part the narration of stories about the past, but also it is very much linked to rituals and performances, where these stories also play an important part. So this is basically what I then followed in the years after these early beginnings, and I recorded stories, everyday narratives, but also eventually I went into the ritual forms of speaking, which also are very much connected to the concept of the past. So basically, but this is just a general introduction. I will now soon get into the stories themselves. Basically, among the Rai, and I will now rely mainly on my study on the Mewang Rai, but I found also very similar stories about the Puma Rai, and Kintang Rai, and Sumi Rai in part, and also among the Limbu, though the situation is somewhat different there, but I'm still starting to understand this tradition as well. So roughly you can say there are three general topics. The first phase, or the first part of the mythology, as you can see, as a grand narrative, is about the origins of the early beginnings, of the beginning of creation. Then you have the stories about the culture hero, as I call him, a figure who's very prominent in many stories. And then the third part is also, as already indicated, very important, the migration, the stories about where did the ancestors actually come from, and how did they actually end up in this particular village where people reside now. So just many my right friends and Limbu friends will know this story, so I will just roughly sum up the early part of this creation stories. So here we have one creator goddess, and it's important that it's a woman. name. Neymar, Myanmar, similar names. And it's interesting that in the early phase of the creation, there were only women. So actually these stories are, you could say, they are about gender issues very much, and that's why they're still very much important. And even though it's about the very early past, I have to stress that these figures are very much alive in the present as well, and that the stories are very much part of everyday life, because, for example, Somnima is very much associated with the practice of reading and other techniques. But here, in the beginning, the story goes that there were only women, and Somnima was actually the daughter of another ancestral divinity, and she ended up being unsatisfied with the situation that there are only women, so she was looking for a husband, and there was none around on the earth, but she heard about that there's one up in the sky, and then there were some birds taking her up to the sky, and then she found Parang, the first name being, but actually when she eventually went up there in the sky, then she found that he's very ugly. So he had a huge, there are different descriptions, he had a huge goiter, some say, which was a common problem in earlier days, and well, some say he was just long-haired freak somehow. She didn't somehow like him. Some described him like a Shaiva sadhu, which I found interesting. But anyway, the reason is she was for some reason rejecting him, and Parang, of course, was not happy about that. So he thought about a trick to solve this, because he was apparently attracted to Somnima, but he resorted to the trick of drying out the earth, and so almost to the point that Somnima was dying of thirst. He was almost passing away, and then he left his semen on a leaf, and she was more or less forced, so the story goes, to drink the semen, and from that she became pregnant. And so this is a very kind of remedial story. She became pregnant and eventually gave birth to the different species, to the thorny creepers, to various forms of various kinds of bamboo, and then eventually to a tiger, bear, monkey, and finally the first men were her children. So this is just the beginning of the story. It goes on and on about the different children, how they eventually struggled and quarreled among each other. I will leave that out, but it's just to show you that here some important issues are being treated, and especially the relationship with animals is, I think, significant. That the animals, wild animals, are seen as siblings, and this is anyway also, I think, how the concept with nature is thought about. But of course there were developments later on, and as I said, quarrels among siblings already started there, and this is something which is repeated in various other stories as well. I will go on and now come to the second section of the stories about the culture hero. Now this is also a very important story, which you have almost in all the groups in a very similar fashion. He is called Kakshulukpa. Also here the names are similar, but I found interesting that actually similar stories of this kind of a figure who brought about culture eventually are found also in various parts of the eastern Himalaya. But that's maybe another issue. First, let me roughly tell you the story about Kakshulukpa. He's actually depicted as an orphan. He started off as a small boy without parents. He had only two sisters. And these two sisters first after him, but at that time people were very poor, and in some stories it says that he was just starving because the situation was very bad, and so he fell asleep, and the sisters thought that he was dead. And then they flew away. They became birds, it says, and one basically married up somewhere in the mountains, and the other went down to the plains, and then they were gone. And Kakshulukpa was left alone. He was, of course, very lonely, didn't know what to do, but because the sisters had thought that he was dead, they put him like in a grave. So it's in a way the beginning of death rituals. They gave him a little knife, and from that when he woke up, the only things he had. So what to do? He had to think about how to make a living out of this. So he managed to sow the seed, banana tree grew up, and he fed on these bananas. And he had a knife, so he cut things from the forest. So eventually he made a living out of it. And then there are some stories that there was evil demons and witches making his life miserable, but he eventually managed to trick all these evil beings, and eventually they managed to settle down. And then there's a story about how he found his wife by fishing, by hunting, that he managed to find his wife, who was Nagaraja Kochori. So he was a serpent being, which is also yes, I hope the sound is okay. So this is the story of Kakshulukpa, who's eventually then settled down. He's the one who built the first house. So this is the typical act of the culture hero, the creation of the most important cultural achievement, one could say, building a house and establishing the shrines for the ancestors and so on. And that's why actually the description how their house is being built is also part of the myth. There's certain, again, animals who show Kakshulukpa how to actually use certain technology of beams that the house is actually then fixed and stable. So he eventually begins to inaugurate the house, so he has to start to do a ritual for that, and now he remembers that he has two sisters, and decides that he has to find these two sisters, and again he sends out certain animals, and actually he does find the sisters. They come back, and then they celebrate the house inauguration, which in a way is also actually a form of marriage, so a wedding ritual. And this is exactly then the myth which is evoked when first of all, when houses are built. Kakshulukpa is also commemorated, and the rituals refer to Kakshulukpa, and also during the weddings and also during harvest rituals, he plays an important role in rituals. So you see that these stories are not just stories about the past, but they very much go and also frame present-day practices. So yes, I think I will now proceed to the third part of the stories, and I think they are particularly important for contemporary identity debates. These are now these different stories about migration. And here it's interesting that among the Rai in particular, the place of origin where the ancestors are said to come from is down in the plains. So for various other groups, if you go to the Burung or Magar, usually it says that ancestors came from the north. In the eastern part of Nepal among Kiranti, the story is that they came usually from the south, and the place of origin is where all the waters flow, and that's very much a mythical place, but also a place which does exist in reality, because it's identified with Barakshetra, the pilgrimage site at the confluence of the seven Koshis, the Sapta Koshi Doban, or the confluence, where there's now a big Vaishnava Tirtha, and it's not exactly there, but a bit further down, that this Koalung, the notion where every beings basically came from and migrated from, is located. So the stories, I will not go into the details, but among the Rai, especially, it's a story of four brothers who were, some say they came out of the earth, or in any case, it's not clear where exactly they came from, but they were starting their migration from there, and then they went north, following the course of the four rivers, the Dut Koshi, the Arun Koshi, and the Tamur Koshi, and then the three rivers, and the youngest brother, he actually stayed down in the terrain. So this, I think, is a very important concept which I found among various communities. Among the Mewahang, it says the eldest brother was Kambuhang, that's the ancestor of the Tulung there, but also some say of the Tulung Rai and maybe Chamling Rai. Then you have those groups from the Arun Valley, the Mewahang, Yampu Rai, and Lohorung, deriving from the second brother, and the third is Limbuang. Limbuang who went up the Dut Koshi, and eventually the fourth brother is the one who stayed down, because the story goes that they started all four to walk up to the north, but then the youngest brother got lost, and so he had to stay, whereas the three elder brothers went up, and then they had to cross the river, which was a big problem because it was just too huge. These are big, huge rivers. Then again we have a story about quarrels among brothers, because the eldest brother, he crossed first, he's the smartest one it seems, and then he tricked the other brother and said, well, he did a blood offering. This was the crucial thing. With a blood offering he could cross the river, but he tricked his second brother in saying, well, I killed my sister, which was not true. And so the second brother almost did the same thing, but then he found a solution to circumvent this issue, and he offered blood from his finger, one version of it says. So the blood offering started from that moment, and it was very important for their further migration. Then, as I said, they went up these different rivers, and eventually they settled down in the different villages. And then there are further stories about how the different villages were founded, that the different spirits of the villages had to be satisfied. And again, there are other stories about quarrels, about land, and how the territory was defined, and how one brother cheated the other brother. So there are many stories about this, and you see that these are stories about the past, but they are all still very much relevant for the present, because they are taken as reasons for why those people have more land than we, and why also some people eat, for example, goat meat, and others eat goat meat. So many of these so-called practices are derived from the story which I told here. So this you can see that these migration stories are very much important for contemporary relations among these groups. I know that we talk, my colleague Divyang and I talked about it recently, that there's big discussion about the concept of Kirat here in Nepal as compared to Sikkim and Darjeeling, because there is some argument whether the Rai and Limbu are actually both Kirat, or whether there's a fundamental difference between Rai and Limbu. So this is some of the issues which are very much discussed contemporarily. And you see that there is some answer to that in these myths, but of course you can also argue about these myths, and there are many different versions, and you also get other versions where the names of the brothers are different. So again, you can see that the stories also can be used to kind of rationalize certain ideas. But I think I will come now to my conclusion, or to the last part actually, is to look more at contemporary developments. If I have a few more minutes, I don't know, I think we should also have enough time for discussions. Therefore, I come now to my last section, which looks at the developments, especially in the 20th century, because there was a big religious movement, especially among the Limbu, but it also affected the whole of eastern Nepal, because there was more and more of a kind of reformist idea that somehow the mundum should be changed and reformed. And this was particularly led by one Limbu called Falgunanda, who founded a religion called the Satyahangma Dharma, and he very much exhorted his Limbu brothers and sisters to stop doing blood sacrifice and also stop doing rituals with using beer and rachi, which is very much part of the mundu, the traditional mundu. So you can see, especially looking at these myths, where you see that blood sacrifice is very important, and also, I didn't mention the beer, but also Kachalupa, of course, having founded agriculture, having first planted millet and started raising pigs and chicken and so on, is very much also seen as the founder of these traditions. You can imagine that a reform of all these traditions is a very fundamental change of cultural practices. But Falgunanda was very successful. He was a Limbu who actually had been in the British Army for some time in the First World War, but he came back, and he was also very much affected by Bhakti Sampradaya, a tradition of called Josmani. Some of you might know that, which was very important in Nepal. And so he was kind of getting different influences and putting these together, and came eventually back to Nepal to reform this religion. And he had, of course, he had seen Hindu religious practices, was affected by them, but he very much tried to go back to his Limbu roots and create a new Mundum religion without these negative aspects as he saw it of blood sacrifice and offering alcohol, beer made of millet to the ancestors. So that was a time when there were also political problems because due to the migration history, many of the Kiranti, many Ryan Limbu lost land to immigrating groups, especially Brahmins and Kshetris, who acted as money lenders, and they lost their land. And so Pagunanda was promising that if they reform their religion in the way he suggested, that they would get back their Tibat land, that they wouldn't spend so much money on all these blood offerings, sacrificing pigs and offering beer, which is of course always a costly affair. So by exhorting these reforms and calling for these reforms, he was promising that wealth and power would come back to the Kiranti, which was seen as constantly being on the losing ground, because after the Gorkha conquest, of course, the situation for the Kiranti was getting worse and worse after they were more or less defeated in the Gorkhali wars. So Fagunanda was, of course, seen not very positively by the Rana rulers. You can imagine he was seen as a seditionist, and for some time he had actually been called. He had been held by the police, by the Barahakim in Bankuta, and questioned. He eventually became free, and because he was always on the move, traveling up the hills, went up to Kanchenjunga with his followers and also to other places. He was also, I think, difficult to get hold of. So this is just what the recent developments are, because now, of course, Pagunanda is dead since 1949. He died just before the end of the Rana rule. But after some years, another person from his same lineage, Atmananda Lingden, as he's called, is now seen as his reincarnation. He's very powerful in eastern Nepal. He has a big kind of ashram on a hill in Larumba in eastern Nepal, and sees himself as a kind of spiritual leader of all the Kiranti. So you can see this is a kind of movement which has also effects here in the valley. Even though I should stress it's not that all the Kiranti are followers of him. It's still, I think, a smaller number, maybe middle class particularly, but it's a movement which also has effects, of course, in the villages. So the point to conclude is that, and I should stress here, I haven't mentioned it, that Fagunanda also started to propagate the Limbu script, because there is a Kiranti script which was invented in the 18th century by a Limbu monk in Sikkim, and this script was also discovered, you might know, by or propagated by Iman Singh Chomchong, who was professor here at Chugaon University, but also Fagunanda took up these ideas and propagated the script, and also education that was very much linked to it. And so this was a quite fundamental change of the Mundum tradition, you can imagine, because now the oral tradition, and now I come back to the storytelling and the orality of this, the storytelling, the orality of the religious tradition became fundamentally changed, because now it was the book. Now everyone in the followers of Atmananda have the Mundum in the form of a book, which they regard as sacred, and at the same time people complain that in the villages the priests are less and less knowledgeable. Yes, I think there's a fundamental change going on, and of course you could say that perhaps I also contributed to this change, because as an anthropologist I also went out in the field, did recordings, and eventually started to write down the Mundum. So I can see that this is a general process, and actually some of my Nepali friends were inspired by my work and also started writing down the text, because they noticed that the elders were not so knowledgeable anymore. So you can see this is a very fundamental and ambiguous kind of process, and that's what now I think how I can conclude. I will just make some concluding remarks, and then I think we can get into the discussion. So I think it's become clear that oral traditions are still a very much lively practice here in Nepal. I should stress that if you go to the villages in East Nepal, you can still hear all these stories being told. And I think it will continue for some time, but also at the same time one has to say that they are increasingly endangered. And therefore you have this tendency that these things are written down. If you go to the bookstores, you find more and more little booklets of the Mundum in various forms, discussions or studies also of the Mundum, and also, for example, Fagunanda's oracles are also being written down, have been written down by his disciples, and are part of this tradition. This gives you some reflections on methodology. I think it's important, if anybody of you wants to study oral traditions, I can only encourage you. It's important to have to study different versions, as many versions as you can get, because often you find the notion that there's only one correct version, and often people were reluctant to tell me stories because they said, well, somebody else knows it better. I cannot tell it to you, but this is nonsense, because no version is absolutely true, and none is false, so you just have to report whatever is being told. And it's interesting then to compare these different versions and contextualize these different versions. And for that it's important to see and always record who was telling the story, when was the story being told, where was it told, and what was the general context. So I think all stories are still a very challenging field here, especially here in Nepal, not only in eastern Nepal, also in other parts. You can see that this is a very fascinating field. on the one hand, you can see that many of the stories have a rather stable structure. You have recurrent themes, but on the other hand, you can also see that the stories are adapted, that they are changing, and that they also change according to the historical and social context. And so all these things, I think, are very challenging and fascinating to look at. And finally, let me stress again that this writing down is a very important process. I think it's still little understood what really changes in a tradition when things are written down. In a way, it's a fixation. Something is fixed and pinned down. But on the other hand, this is never completely a fixation, but there are also always ways to again adapt and change at least the interpretation. But I think with this I will stop here, and yes, we'll be happy to get into discussions with you and answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Martin.